When I got married, my wife was an elementary band and orchestra director. Actually, at the time, only a band director. And we were in Florida at the time, and she only had an after-school band because they had no band program during the day in elementary school. And so she started one after school, but they only had, she basically only had enough time to teach the main instrument groups, the flute, the clarinet, saxophone, trumpet, trombone. And so she started giving me these assignments. I need you to write something that works with just these 5 instruments. And we've only learned 5 notes. And we've only learned this. And we've only learned that. And that actually was what made the entire starter series come to life for FJH. It was pretty interesting how that all just kind of came to be.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the great fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I really appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you know 1 or 2 people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. And now, on to my next guest, Brian Balmages. Hi, Brian.
Hey, how are you?
Great. Brian, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So, Brian, I'm sure that my listeners know your name. I have mostly band directors who listen to the show, but just in case, can you introduce yourself and tell everyone who you are and what you do?
Well, let's face it, they don't know my name, right? They think I'm Balmages or Balmage or Balmages. I like Balmages because it's a French cheese, but unfortunately, no, it's not new. So it is Balmages. You got it right. Bal, I tell everybody, Bal like pal, Mages like pages. When I was in middle school, I would say a poem on pages by Brian Balmages. That was my poetry unit signature. So that's step 1, right? A little about myself. I'm a product of a public school band. My father was my elementary band director. Oddly enough, he was my wife's elementary band director 3 years later. So he actually knew my wife before I did, which kind of is a little awkward, but that's okay. And so I grew up playing in bands in school. And then, of course, in college, I did the orchestral thing as well. But professionally, I cut my teeth in orchestras. I was in the Miami Symphony Orchestra for a while. I played as a student in the Disney Grammy Orchestra. I played in the Henry Mancini Institute Orchestra out in LA. So I did a lot of orchestral playing, and that was sort of the bulk of my professional experience. And so that kind of merged those two worlds together, and that's probably the best reason why I do a lot of writing, not just for band, but for orchestra as well.
Mm-hmm. Brian, what was your instrument?
It is trumpet. I don't play, I say is because it's getting close to Easter, so I'm practicing right now. I don't know when this will air, but yeah. So I don't play that much anymore because it became a challenge to travel as much as I was, or as I am, and writing as much as I am, and then coming home and having to put 2-3 hours in on the horn every day. So I enjoy my one time a year. I go down to Florida and Naples, and I play Easter down there with some of the folks that are in the Naples Phil, and it's a great time. I bring my family, and I've been doing it for the last 20 years. So that's my main instrument. I also do play piano, but that's more recreational for me. It's something that I would do. I'd play weddings, I'd play Christmas parties and stuff like that, mostly by ear. It's something that I do think about sometimes when I write, but not always. But we can certainly get into that later.
Sure. So are you from Florida?
No, I'm from Baltimore, and that's where I've moved back to Baltimore. People always ask why I left Miami, and sometimes I ask the same question. especially when you have a bunch of really miserably cold and rainy and junky days. But no, I grew up in Baltimore, and then I lived in Virginia for 5 years when I was at James Madison. Then I went down to Miami, did my master's degree down at the University of Miami, but then I stayed in Miami because the symphony was down there, and also my publisher, FJH, is in Fort Lauderdale. So it was kind of like the perfect situation for me. And so I hung out there for a while until it got to the point where I was doing enough traveling that it really didn't matter where I lived. And so my wife and I decided that if I was going to be traveling, it didn't matter if I lived in Florida or Baltimore. And since all of our family was here, it made sense to move back to this area.
So, boy, you have a couple connections to Jim Stevenson then, huh?
Just a few.
I mean, the whole former professional trumpet player, composer, Naples, the whole thing. I'm thinking about Jim a lot as you talk.
Jim is a very dear friend. We bounce things off of each other a lot. We anytime we find ourselves in the same city, whether it be Chicago or Naples or Baltimore or wherever, we try to make it a point of getting together. We do have very similar backgrounds in that we are both former trumpet players first, who never really formally studied composition, but suddenly stumbled into it. I think he was a much better trumpet player than I was. He would probably say the opposite, but I'm pretty confident that I am correct and he's wrong, that he was the better trumpet player. But it's a neat way to kind of see how we both found our way into this world.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's why I do these interviews, because these are fascinating stories. I think that when we listen to how people get their starts, I think it gives us inspiration for the rest of us.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot in there sort of to untangle just in the very beginning here. So I want to ask you about your dad being a band director. And I hear this a lot from my guests, especially the most successful people that I talk to. Do you think that gave you any advantages to have your father as a band director growing up?
You know, it's tricky because I had him for fifth grade band, right? And so I think for me, it wasn't about what I technically learned, because he didn't really even teach me trumpet. I was mostly just self-taught. It was around the house, and I would pick it up and play, and he would say, "Nope, that fingering is 1 and 3," and that was it. But I never listened from him, and so I was mostly self-taught. Same thing with piano. I just would play because it was there. I think what benefit that I had was basically exposure. I think I was exposed to so much music. My father always had music playing. There were days where the Canadian brass would be playing. There were days when the music, like Pippin is one that I remember so vividly, would be playing, and I would hear that music, and I would start playing that on the piano. My father was playing in a community band, and he was a Peabody graduate, also a trumpet player. And so, I would hear that. And so there were days that we would sit down and play duets. There were also days where we had 2 keyboards in the living room, and my father also plays by ear. And so we would just yell out the name of a tune, a Billy Joel tune, U2, whatever it was. And we had a little drum machine, and he would kick on the drum machine. We would yell out a key, and the two of us would just start playing together.
That's awesome.
Kind of like a Howl at the Moon kind of thing, right? And we would do this sometimes for half an hour long, and just have fun. It was a great bonding moment. And I think that was a big thing for me, was literally that exposure. I should also add that my parents were great about not pushing me. Mm-hmm. My father never, a matter of fact, almost to a fault, they never told me to practice. And actually, I didn't really practice very much through high school. I was I had a natural talent on trumpet that was never really fully realized because I never practiced. And it wasn't until I got to college that I really started to put in the work and played every day, some days 5 to 8 hours a day, just because it's what I enjoyed doing. And so they were great about just letting me do what I wanted to do and not pushing too hard. And at the same time, they're always supporting me in anything that I was doing. They would be there every concert, every All-State, every whatever it would be. They would be there and always supporting. And so that was a great gift.
Yeah, as I look at my kids, I think about what you're saying is because I try not to push my kids as well, but my daughter's only in second grade, but I already see her. Like the other day I was working on something and she comes up and she's flipping through the Instrumentalist magazine on the table, and my wife's a cello professor at the local university. She's always practicing around the house, and so my kids are just kind of exposed to it. And I wonder what that influence is going to be. That's kind of why I asked this question, because I kind of am watching it play out in front of me.
Absolutely. And I have the same thing happening in my house. I have two children. One played in band for a little bit, and it clearly was not his thing. And that's fine. He abused the saxophone for a year. And that's fine. He's much more of a visual kid, and we accept that. And we let him do that. He's much more of a hands-on sculpting, drawing, painting. And so we let him run with that. He does want to do guitar and piano, and that's fine. I will encourage that. And then my younger son, who's in fourth grade, he is trumpet. And he's really, really into it right now. He practices almost every day and really loves it. So he and I are starting to play some duets and do things like that. So we'll see where it goes. But again, I don't push him at all. His band director and I have a great relationship, and she knows that I am a band parent first, and that I'm not going to come in there and say, well, why don't you do it this way? And so it's a very great relationship. She has to come in and work with the kids whenever it fits, or I'll come in and play with the jazz band, and it's really a great setup.
When you think back beyond your father, do you have any other memories of sort of early pieces or band directors or memories that sort of triggered you becoming a professional musician? Or was it just growing up with your father in the house?
No, I mean, certainly growing up with my father in the house. One of the most powerful initial experiences that I remember was, it's interesting because I was the kid who was always in All-State and All-County, but I couldn't tell you the name of any of the conductors. I never researched who they were. I would just show up and be like, okay, that's who they are. And there was never like a, whoa, this is so-and-so. But one year I do remember having Harlan Parker, who is at Peabody Conservatory here in Baltimore. And he was my All-State conductor. And that year we played David Holsinger's To Tame the Perilous Skies. And I just remember the whole program was great. We did the homage to Periton and all of the just such great music. And I remember just that rush, that tingling down the spine, that, oh my gosh, this is so awesome. I could do this for the rest of my life feeling. Not from the composer standpoint. I never even considered the fact of being a composer. I was interested in doing, MIDI sequencing. I was interested in recording engineering, but at that time, never even once considered the fact that I would become a composer or a conductor. I just knew that I loved music, and that was just I always tell people I always knew I wanted to be in music. I just kind of bounced around a lot in terms of what I wanted to do.
I always knew I wanted to be a teacher. I just didn't know it was going to be a music teacher.
Yeah, see, I always knew. I thought my initial thing was I want to be a band director. Dad's a band director. I want to be a band director. Right, and then from there I started getting involved in 4-track recording when those came out, and I got involved with songwriting, and then that led to film scoring. That led to conducting the film scores. But all the while I was practicing my tail off on trumpet and starting to take auditions and do that. And I thought, man, this is really what I want to do. And really did enjoy that. And then, I started climbing this composer conductor ladder and found myself climbing much higher on that ladder than I was climbing on the trumpet ladder. And that's not why I left the trumpet. But it certainly made me realize that this is probably the most complete reason that I'm here on this planet, is to do what I'm doing now with composing and conducting.
So let's untangle that knot. So I know that you you did your undergraduate at James Madison, and I know that you were there at the same time as Robert W. Smith. But you mentioned that you weren't
Correct.
composing much. Did you do much studying, or did you know Robert? What was your relationship there?
It's funny because when I got there, I was a music industry major. And so, like I said, I was really into recording engineering. I was really into mixing. When I got to college, I was already writing some music, not a lot, but I was writing some music, and I was doing some multi-track recording and MIDI, and I wanted to learn how to record all that. I wanted to learn mics. I wanted to learn studio consoles, electronics, all of those things. And Robert happened to be one of the program directors for the music industry program. I had actually never even played a piece by Robert, which is nearly impossible, right? But I didn't. And so everybody kept saying, "Oh, Robert Smith." And I was like, "Who's Robert Smith?" And sure enough, I met him. And as part of our degree program, I took arranging from him. We all took arranging from him. Orchestration. It was a great class. And then from there, I started to take some other things with him, such as the recording engineering, mixing, getting into the studio. We took classes in music merchandising. We took songwriting. And then I also did independent studies with him in film scoring, where he would give us a film with the music all scrubbed out, and we would be, he had me write the music, and then we would put the orchestra together. I would conduct it, record it, and then we would put it to the film. So it was a really real world experience. It was great. And then the last thing that we did together before he left, because he eventually went down to Troy in Alabama, but the last thing we did together was he was with the SMAD, the School of Media, Art, and Design. And they were tasked with creating a new promotional video for JMU. And Robert asked me to come on for an independent study to be the film composer for that. And so as part of that, I wrote all of the background music for the entire film, and then came in, conducted it with the symphony orchestra. And then the School of Media, Art, and Design engineers mixed it and put it to film. And it was, again, a great project. And I can't say enough about my time with Robert. Even though I never studied composition with him, I learned so much from him in terms of even packaging yourself. We would do classes where he would show two different submission things. And one of them I remember was from John Tagenhorst, who, of course, is a film composer, a video. He writes for everything. He writes for traditional ensembles as well. But he showed us his packaging, and it just looked so professional that when you opened it, you just felt like, wow, this is amazing, even though you didn't hear anything. And so all of those things just really became a driving force behind the way that I presented myself to others, the way I prepared myself, and ultimately the way I attempted to market myself and show my music.
He's got his finger in kind of like everything. Like he sort of knows everything, it feels like.
He's a brilliant man. Yeah, people don't realize how intelligent he is, but he keeps up with so many different things. And I certainly wouldn't call him a jack of all trades, master of none. But what I would call him is, when you call a master of anything, he's sort of like, he is a master of the music industry. And the music industry is a really big thing, right? There are so many elements in there. There's the legal elements, there's the recording elements, there's the management elements, there's the artist elements, there's the contract elements. But he knows that stuff, and he's lived through a lot of that as well. And so he's very, very knowledgeable in that world.
So, Brian, how about after university? You went to the University of Miami after James Madison. How did you sort of move from being a trumpet player to a composer? You mentioned that you started to climb higher up that ladder. When did you first know that?
Well, it's interesting. My bulk of my, start of my compositional career was writing for groups that I was playing in. Right. So at JMU, I was in the faculty brass quintet. I wrote for the faculty brass quintet. I was in the brass ensemble. I wrote for them. I was in the symphonic band or the wind ensemble. I wrote for them. When I got to Miami, I was writing film scores and conducting them with the symphony orchestra. While I was doing that, other composers started saying, hey, will you conduct my music with this? And so then it got to the point where during the student reading session days, I would conduct most of those, along with one of the orchestral conducting TAs, because none of the other composers felt comfortable really conducting in front of a group. And so I was kind of simultaneously cutting both of my teeth there. And then I guess professionally, even when I made the Miami Symphony Orchestra, they started asking me to write things for them. Again, similar to Jim Stevenson and Naples Phil. And so they started saying, hey, we want you to write this, or we want you to write that. Okay, so I would write a little bit of those things and hear it. One of the biggest things I always tell people is that everything that I ever wrote, I got played, or I got recorded, or I got read. And that was a big learning thing for me. And there were things that I wrote that I absolutely loved, and there were things that I wrote that were terrible. They were terrible. I always tell people the story. One of the first pieces that I wrote was for trumpet ensemble. And it's because I was a trumpet player and we were in a trumpet ensemble. And I always joke around because the trumpet player in me is what caused me to write the piece, because somebody else in the ensemble did an arrangement of Danny Boy. And everybody's like, wow, this is great. And I thought, wait a minute, you did an arrangement. I'm going to do an original. I'm going to be better. That was my thought process. And so I wrote this piece and got it in there, and we started playing it. And there were parts of it that just sounded awful. And I couldn't figure out why, because when I was writing it, it sounded great. And then I realized that I was writing at the piano. And unlike the piano, the trumpet ensemble does not have a sustain pedal. And all of those things that I was playing on piano with sustain pedal on suddenly sounded awful. And so I learned, right? I learned a lot about that. And so I kept writing for all these different groups that I was in. And then I had friends who were music ed majors in college that were graduating saying, I loved all the things that we played in college, but my kids can't play any of that stuff. Do you want to try to write something for my band or for my orchestra? And so I tried. And sometimes I think I failed, and sometimes I succeeded. But all the while, I started to learn more and more about myself and about my voice and about who I am. And that just all kind of continued to develop until it got to a point where I realized, hey, I have enough people calling me that I can do this full time.
You and I talked a little bit before the interview about the beginning band music, because that's what I'm doing right now. And I asked you, or I complimented on the fact that you make music for the youngest kids sound sophisticated. And so I was wondering if maybe we could kind of rehash that conversation for the listeners about how that came to be.
I had to get to a point, and this is critical. I had to get to a point where I became comfortable with the fact that I was good at writing beginning band music. And it's really interesting. And I'm getting ahead of myself in a little bit, but there was a period of time where I told you I was writing almost exclusively more difficult music. And then I started writing these easier music. And after a couple of years of it, I started to have not only great success, but I started to feel comfortable with it. But I remember being at the University of Miami, having these really long talks with Gary Green about, should I do this? Because at the time, I thought we were playing music by, David Maslanka. We were playing music by Michael Dougherty. We were playing even stuff by Donald Erb, Michael Colgrass, these giants, right? And I thought, I want to be like that. That's who I want to be. I want to be like them. And it took me a while to be okay with the fact that I'm not them, I'm me. And that's okay. And so that was sort of the first thing that I think finally unlocked this block that I had with writing for younger players. Once I accepted the fact that it's okay for me to enjoy it, and it's okay for me to be good at it. Right? It doesn't mean that I stopped writing the upper level things, which I haven't stopped doing at all, but it means that it's okay to be good at that. And so what does it mean to be good at that? And I don't use sales or number of performances as a way to gear any of that. As a matter of fact, people always say, which piece of yours has sold the most? I have no clue. And I hope I never do. That's not what would drive it. What does drive it is, number one, I always say there's like two things that I try to really be aware of when writing for especially younger bands. The first one is I had to get to a point where I could still sound like me, even though I was writing for younger players. And notice I didn't say because I was using limitations. I don't like the word limitation, but I do like saying writing for younger players. I think it's a very different approach when you say those two different things. And so people have always said to me, they say, one of the things that we love about you, and somebody said this to me a long time ago, and it stuck with me. They said, everything you write sounds different, but it all sounds like you. It all sounds like you wrote it. And I took that to heart, and I enjoy that because it's like people can recognize something about my music that they realize, hey, it sounds like Brian wrote that, but at the same time, it sounds different from other pieces that I've written. It took me a while to get to a point where I can sound like me, despite the fact that I'm writing for first-year players or second or third year or whatever it might be. And that was a crucial thing for me. If I could not sound like me, I would not do it, because that doesn't do anybody any good. If I just try to write something because it's easy to play, that might as well ask band directors to burn out, and I might as well ask the kids to quit playing because they're not going to be inspired. They're not. And so that was the first part of it. The second part, which we did discuss, was coming to this realization that when you are writing for younger players, especially first-year bands, which my wife was teaching when I started doing it, it's easy to write something that you say is very, very easy, but you have a bass line that requires either tuba, bass, clarinet, or bari sax. And I always mention, but my wife didn't have those instruments, and most of her friends who were teaching beginning band also did not have those instruments. Now, they did come into play 2-3 years down the road, but they didn't have them. And so what you wound up with was all these pieces for beginning band that sounded great when they're recorded by college bands or by professional groups and put on a CD or put onto the catalog. And then you bring them into your own band room and it doesn't work anymore because you have no bass line, or you don't have the horn line all by itself all the time, right? And it doesn't mean you need to double the horn line. You can cue it, and we can talk about that too. There's a very different thing. But making sure that something, you want it to sound good, but it's not going to sound good if a beginning ensemble can't play it with their instrumentation.
It's exceptional music for young kids. I know that my fifth graders really enjoy it. Like, it's amazing to me that my fifth graders, when they ask me to play something, the first piece they ask for is Midnight Sky. And so I have 11-year-olds asking to play slow music.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
I love the fact that in measure 5, you have a major second between the clarinets and the trumpets, and that's not typical for beginning band music.
No, and I've had people send me a note saying, is that a misprint? Is that a misprint? But when you listen to it, there's nothing wrong with it. And here's the problem with that. You say it's not typical, which I agree. I think it's becoming more typical. But the problem is that no one would do that. And then you get into more difficult music, maybe middle school music or upper level middle school music. And every time you have an interval that's not a major chord, kids shy away from it, or they can't hear it. They can't tune it because they're not exposed to it.
Right. They don't have that sound in their ear and their memory.
Oddly enough, that's something that was a big thing with my string music. There were some string composers out there that were also teachers telling me, you can't do that. You can't write minor seconds and major seconds in string music, that in beginning music. They can't do it. And so much of my music is based on those intervals. And suddenly we're finding out that these kids, they can stretch their ear and they can hear it. And just because it's a minor second doesn't mean that all that it's dissonant. Not at all. Sometimes it's the most beautiful sound in the world. It depends on how it's orchestrated.
You obviously write music for more than just beginners. You have music all the way through grade 5 and 6 in your catalog. So tell me, how do you sort of balance that as you write? Do you write a certain amount for each level each year, or do you try to just take the projects as they come?
It's a mixture. I typically will write for a variety of levels each year. And so sometimes it works out, but sometimes I'll take the projects as they come for a grade level. So if I get 5 grade 4 commissions, I'll space them out over 3-4 years. And so somebody might say to me, hey, I want you to write a grade 4. And I'll say, great, I can do it in 3 years. Somebody might say, I want you to write a grade 2. And I'll say, I can do that in 4 years. And then they might say, I want you to grade half, and I can do that in 1 year. So I typically have it in my mind that I will write at various grade levels within a year, always. I always write something for grade 2. I will always write something for grade 1-ish, whether it's a grade half, a grade 1.5, or 1. I will always write something for grade 4 or 5. And so those are like my baseline commissions. And I don't think of them as making sure I've written a grade 1 and making sure I've written a grade 5. I actually think of them as different mediums, right? So some composers are going to say, I can only write 1 or 2 band pieces a year, and then I need to do some chamber music and some quartet music and string music. For me, it's very similar. I could not write 3 or 4 grade 4 or 5 pieces in a row. I think I would burn out. And so for me, it's all about the variety and being able to, gosh, this past year, I wrote like a grade 5 multi-movement band piece. I followed that up with like a grade 2 string piece. After that, I wrote a piece for trombone soloist and octet at the professional level. And then after that, I was writing a beginning band piece. So it was great because every time I had to start writing, I felt like I've been away from you for so long. It's so good to see you again. And it was just a wonderful thing to be able to rekindle that relationship with that particular medium, or forge a new relationship if I've never worked in that medium.
You also write music for string orchestra and for full orchestra. What is it like to switch back and forth between the two?
To me, it's just like picking up a red pencil or versus a blue pencil. My process does not change at all. Ironically, funny story. So some of you folks are like, I didn't know you write orchestra music, right? Or I was actually at Midwest about 3 years ago having a conversation with an orchestra director, and a band director came up and asked me a question about, I think it was Moscow in 1941, the piece like the entire world had played. And the orchestra director, as innocently looking as possible, looked at me and the band director and goes, oh, I didn't know you write band music, right? And of course, the band director is, are you kidding me? What planet are you on? But I love that. And so as to what's it like switching back and forth, the best thing is it's number one, very rejuvenating. I love it. There are things that a band can do that an orchestra cannot do. And there are things that string players can do that you could never do in a band. And so I really enjoy exploring both tonalities. For me, it's a completely different sound, but my approach doesn't change. The only thing that I do change when I write for strings is that I do all of my own bowing. I didn't used to, but musically, that has a massive effect on the piece. And once I realized that, maybe 7 years ago or so, I began doing all my own bowing. And so there's an element in there that's not involved in the band world, where I really think about that. But it really helped me and has made me, I think, be able to write very organically for string players and musically for them, because I understand what physically needs to happen on a crescendo and what needs to happen on a diminuendo, and I can plan that accordingly.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I have worked with young composers, one of the things they often forget to do is put articulation and dynamics in. And those things are so important because that's what shapes the music, and it's kind of the same thing.
Exactly. And sometimes I always tell people, sometimes those markings are put in with a style term, right? So people need to be aware of that as well. Sometimes I'll make a style term because I think sometimes visually it's overwhelming and too visually stimulating or overstimulating to put, a staccato marking on every eighth note in a piece, where sometimes you'll see D, da, da, D, da, da, D, and I know that's how they want it to be played, but at some point kids need to learn, that allegro marcato means space, right? Or something like that. And I think one of the reasons you're seeing a lot more of those markings is because people have become so dependent on sequencing players and different things like Garriton and note performer and the Vienna and all those different samples that are out there, and composers are trying to get it to sound as close as they can to the real thing, and so they over articulate to get the samples to play it back. But I think sometimes all those articulations are more for the samples than they are for the live player.
That's a really excellent point. And, you don't think about this when you're composing, but often I am doing that, and I'm doing it subconsciously.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because, I'll go into a recording session, and sometimes in a recording session, I'll have a player that says, like, I love that you have all these in there because then you can do it in one take and stylistically everything's exactly the way you want it to be. But in a real world situation, there are a lot of pieces that I've written where I don't have those markings on there. And people always say, but the sequencing doesn't sound that great. And I never care about that. I'm not premiering it with a sequencer. I'm premiering it with live players. And style is such a big part of what we do. And while it's important, and I do put a lot of markings in my music, I think it's very easy to get so caught up in sequencers and get caught up in that whole world of samples. And so I've intentionally tried to stay away from that a little bit and not get too caught up, because I know some composers that spend half their time not composing, but trying to make it sound good in whatever sample program they're using.
So let's talk about this from the conductor perspective. We kind of got a little bit into the weeds there, especially the string orchestra stuff. So for the band conductor, I imagine you're a big proponent of interpretation. And so what advice would you give for them when they see your music?
Well, I wouldn't just be my music, it'd be any music, right? Because you don't know this. The most joy that I typically feel is when I'm conducting other composers' music, not my own. And that's because I feel like I grow musically much more from other people's work than my own. But when you talk about interpretation and when you talk about everything, everybody agrees that it's important to be musical and it's important to bring the music off the page and pick whatever generic phrase that you want, right? Pick the cliche phrase, and the music has to be alive. Read between the lines, and people say all these things, but I don't think people very often know what that means or how to achieve it. There's a great quote from Victor Wooten, Bella Fleck and the Flexones, and it goes something along the lines of, he says, I almost never go anywhere where I meet a musician who doesn't agree that music is a language, right? And so I think that's great. He's like, everywhere I go, I almost always will meet somebody, and if I ask them, they will agree that music is a language. But then he follows that up with, he says, but it's very rare to meet somebody who actually treats it like one. And that's pretty powerful, right? Everybody says, oh, music is a language. Well, great, then let's treat it like a language. Let's express. Let's dig in. Let's language doesn't have dynamics in it. The only dynamics we really have are things like exclamation points and question marks, and those don't even necessarily involve dynamics. Those might involve pitch or tempo. Yet we, all of us, speed up, slow down, raise pitch, lower pitch. We phrase, we peak in the middle of the sentence. I'm doing it right now. And we do it all the time, and we do it so naturally. And then when we pick up a baton or when we pick up an instrument, that's the first thing that gets turned off. And suddenly, now that we have a baton in our hand, the most important thing is to keep the tempo and to cue. And to me, that's not conducting. I mean, it's functional, but I hold my ensemble to, I'm sorry, your job is to come in, right? Your job is to maintain time. My job is to make you understand what we are trying to achieve here and to make you feel, and my job is to interact with you in such a way that as the audience hears this piece, they begin to cry because they are so emotional, or they begin to get so nervous, or their heart is racing because they don't know what's going to happen next, or they're closing their eyes and they are picturing the most beautiful scene and the most peaceful moment, whatever it is, that we are transforming their mental state at will. At will. That, to me, is what I'm always after when we talk about interpretation. I've heard so many, and I've been very fortunate, and I will never take this for granted. I've been so fortunate to go to Midwest and to go to national conferences and state conferences and have the privilege of hearing a group that is accomplished enough to make it to one of those venues perform my music. And it's a wonderful thing that I always am grateful for. That being said, I can also tell you that I can probably count on both hands the number of concerts that I have been to that I can recall being musically moved to a point of just tears or passion, or whatever it might be. And those other times, I can tell you, sitting in the audience, just sitting there and people around me going, wow, that sounds great. And the whole time, me just thinking, they missed the whole point. They've missed the entire point of what I'm trying to say. And they've played it so safe that they killed it. We want to make sure, how many times do we see that? Well, I'm a middle school band director and there's a retardando, but I'm not really going to do it because I don't want the ensemble to fall apart. So I'm going to be safe and I'm going to keep the group together, and all I'm going to do is musically kill the moment in the process. We'll destroy the music, but the ensemble will make sure it doesn't fall apart. So that way we're all good.
So I just recently talked to Phil Obato, who's a band director at Allen, Texas. Well, what he said in our conversations, he talked about overprogramming and how that's such a problem, because when the kids are only worried about the notes on the page and we're only worried about getting the reproduction, then we're not playing the music. And I think about that, that's the real peril of overprogramming.
Oh, it's awful. And we have become a society of, I must go in at grade 5 or grade 6 or grade 3. And we become obsessed with that. And so we've got to go in at that grade level. And then I've got to get a 1, or I've got to get we've got to get better than last year. And don't get me wrong. I think it is important to have some kind of benchmark. I mean, we've got to hold programs accountable. I get it. And that's fine. But when was the last time, this is going to sound ridiculous, but when was the last time that you hear an orchestra say, you know what, we're not going to play Chicago Symphony, or we're not going to play Tchaik 2 because that's the easier symphony? They don't think that way. They never think that way. They're thinking about what's beautiful music. Now, if a group needs to go in at grade 5 or grade 6 and they need to do the fine, do that at festival. But for the rest of the year, just program beautiful music. Program great music that's going to inspire your kids, that's going to inspire you. Because all these band directors that I meet that are just like, gosh, I'm burning out. That's because they're so worried about everything else that they forget to pick music that they are fired up about. We're in a world where band directors have got to do bus duty. They've got to fill out forms. They're in meetings. They're doing this. They're being held accountable for things that they didn't used to be held accountable for. They've got to do this training. They've got to do fire drill training. They're doing Alice training. They're doing all of these things that have nothing to do with what they signed up for. And their sacred place, the most beautiful place in their lives, is when they step onto that podium every day. And you better believe, if that is your sacred place, then whatever you are playing better be the holy grail of music, because that is the one thing that you are looking forward to every day, and you would not ever want to take away from that experience by programming music that doesn't move you so much.
Really quickly, I want to talk about the process of if someone wanted to commission you. I know that you have a long wait for a lot of your pieces, but what would that look like if someone wanted to contact you?
I try to be very open and straightforward with commissions. And to be honest, I don't know whether it's half or close to half, but a decent number of people that commission me are doing it for the first time. They've never done it before. So it's not this ambiguous thing that, I haven't commissioned people before, so I can't do it. I usually make it very straightforward. We talk, they tell me what they're interested in. I usually ask them a series of questions. The big questions that I want to know is, sometimes people just say, I want you to write a piece for my group. And they don't realize, I don't know if you're a band or an orchestra. Like, what are you? Are you a string orchestra? Are you a full orchestra? I don't even know. And so I usually like to know, obviously, what type of group, what grade level. Now, when we talk about grade level, it changes, as we all know, from state to state and from area to area, what people call a grade 2 or grade 3 or what people call a middle school piece. So very often I'll even say, are there other pieces of mine that you've played that have been a very good fit for that group? And then that'll really help me. Okay, so, you say you want a grade 3, but then you name a bunch of my grade 2 pieces, or you've named a bunch of my grade 4 pieces. And so that'll give me a better idea. And then we'll say, how long do you want this piece to be? What are you going after? And then do you have a time frame in mind? And so we get all that information down, and then I'll say, this is what I would charge. I typically do not, I'm not flexible there, really. Sometimes people will say, well, can we get something a little bit shorter? Okay, then we can be shorter. But I don't bargain with people and they'll say, we only have this amount, so will you do it for that? And it's not out of being stubborn, but it's out of respect for all the other people that have commissioned me and to be fair to them. The last thing I would want is for somebody to say, we raised X amount of money to commission this piece, and now we found out that this other group commissioned a very similar type of piece for 2/3 of what we did. And so I want to be fair to everybody. But I also want people to realize that, listen, this is a major emotional investment that I make as well. And so I want to make sure we're all on the same page. What does it look like? Typically for me, this is very different with different composers. I always ask for a 50% deposit. And so whatever price that we're looking at, I'll ask for half up front. And then the balance I will have due once I've finished the score. And so they'll see it, they'll hear it, a mock-up of it. If I'm nice, I'll put in all the sample articulation so they can hear short notes the way it's supposed to be. And then at that point, the balance will be due as I'm getting them the parts. And so it's a very straightforward process. It's a very easy contract. I want this to be accessible to people. I want people to be able to feel like they have the opportunity to bring new music into the world. I want kids to be able to have the experience of saying, wow, I was part of a premiere, and with the idea that maybe this will inspire them down the road. Maybe this will inspire them to become creators of music, or maybe this will inspire them to become champions of music, even if they become a doctor. maybe they will remember that experience and they will become a board member of their local symphony orchestra, or they will join their local community band. That's what we're trying to do with these projects. We're not trying to, always cultivate the next Mahler or the next Mozart. Although Robert Smith always talks about, the next Mozart's in somebody's band room, somebody's orchestra room. There is somebody. And so what are we doing to motivate them? What are we doing to inspire them? I think I got off topic, but I still answered your question.
I love that you got off topic. And Brian, what I really admire about you is that you are very passionate and a strong advocate for what we do in music education. And I know that you had that viral video a few years ago. Was that the Georgia decision, if I recall?
Oh, wow, yeah.
I mean, I remember that vividly, watching that and like, yes, tell us what it is, And I like the fact that you're very passionate about these things.
I am. I think some of your listeners have seen me conduct their region groups or their all states or whatever it might be. One thing I always talk about though is I always, in that concert, I do a mini Let's Go music talk, right? And I do advocacy. The thing that I do though is I think sometimes we shoot at the wrong angle, and we always talk about test scores, and that's all great. But we talk about test scores, and we talk about dropout rates and all this, and that's all important. Don't get me wrong, but what we leave out is the most important part, that it defines our culture, right? It defines who we are. Every culture throughout the world has in part been defined by their artists. What would Italy be without its art? What would France and Spain be without their art, without their music? It is what would we be without blues, without jazz, without, even things like hip hop, whatever it might be, R&B. I mean, all of these styles that have emerged, and it's one of the first things that any society goes to is its artists. Anytime we have a major event, a wedding, a funeral, a ceremony, the first thing we're doing is we're talking about music. And so I would much prefer to take that approach and say, you know what, we're not doing music for kids to have higher test scores. We're doing music so that kids can be more human, so that kids can learn what it is to be alive, for kids to be able to feel, for kids to be able to work together. Maybe that's the biggest part of it all. We are in a society right now that bickers and fights and argues and cuts each other down and calls each other out and all these things. Yet in this world of music, all these kids come together. The most beautiful thing about an honor group is you go in, I'll go into a place like Arkansas or Alabama or North Carolina or anywhere. And you have these kids that come from these major cities that go to Starbucks every day and they do this and they do that. And then you have these other kids who have a band program of 6 people and they live on the farm and they do whatever. And then you have other people who are Christian, some are Jewish, some are Muslim, some are nothing. And they all come together for 3 days. And all they care about is making music. Nobody judges anybody. Nobody argues with anybody. Everybody just works together to make something beautiful and better than the individual. And if music can only teach us one thing, boy, wouldn't it be great to do that? So I talk about that because that's a big one. I posted a couple of years ago. I said, wouldn't it be great if I wish all of our politicians had been in honors groups, honor choir, honor band, honor orchestra, because they would have learned that experience of working together.
Yeah. So Brian, I want to ask you the final questions here before we wrap this up. But I did not ask you about your role at FJH. Did you want to talk about that?
Sure. So with FJH, obviously I write music. There's a shocker, right? But I also am the director of instrumental publications. So I basically choose what pieces instrumentally that FJH is going to publish, both for band and orchestra. And so I'm responsible for putting that music together. If there's something compositionally that I think could improve a piece, I'll make a recommendation to a composer. If there's something from an orchestrational standpoint or from a visual standpoint, the way something is written, I'll make suggestions to the composers. And so we'll work together to get the music to a point where it's ready to be read. And then the other thing that I do is I actually conduct all of the recordings, and I've been doing that for the last, 6-7 years now. So all of the FJH recordings that you hear, I'm conducting all of them. And it's important to me because I feel like those recordings used to be solely as a vehicle for band directors to hear a piece and buy it. But now with things like smart music out there and with all of the access that kids have, those recordings are no longer just demo recordings and reference recordings. Those now have to be musical because kids are listening to them. And so I've really enjoyed the opportunity to bring out musically what I think is valuable in each one of those pieces. And so I handle all those things, getting all the music out there.
Okay, let's get into these final questions. Where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
I'll tell you where I draw the line is when there's the issue of musicality, when a group plays so musically and then you can say to them, oh my God, I cried during your performance, but you lost. For me personally, I draw the line at competition. Now, this is not putting everybody else in competition down, but for me personally, I do not judge ever. The only time I have ever judged is when a theme park is involved because I get to ride the ride, but that's it, right? So for me, it's really hard if I hear two performances and both are good, but one of them musically was so much stronger, but the other one technically was so much better. And for me to say that one group, musically that was amazing, but it didn't win. You know, winning to me is always a tricky thing. What that even means. And so to me, I'm just not a competition person. And so that my line is competition for me personally. And again, I'm not taking away from, I think there's a lot of great things that happen as a result of competition. And I think people have very musical experiences as part of competition, but it's not something that I see myself as part of.
Okay, so Brian, one of the things that we struggle with, and I just actually listened to Darcy Williams and Jenna Yee talk about it on the After Sectionals podcast, which I know you've been part of, and they talked about,
they're great.
They are. And they talked about work-life balance, and I've been asking this question for, nearly 80 episodes now, and they've got me thinking about it a little bit differently. And so I often ask, how do you achieve a work-life balance, but also understanding that maybe there isn't always balance?
So my father died 2 weeks ago, and that gave me an opportunity. I posted about this about a week ago. That gave me an opportunity, as with any major life crisis or change, it gives you an opportunity to evaluate, reevaluate, and look at what you've been doing to see whether or not it worked in that moment of crisis. And I have long been very adamant about that work-life balance. And so how do I maintain that? So when my father passed away, I reevaluated my life and realized that I do not have any regrets right now. In that moment where I needed people, I had so many close friends that were there, and not necessarily close colleagues, which were there also, but close friends, people that I've known since before college. And the people that I've known since then, but they're just the floods of emails, and not just, I'm so sorry for your loss, but repeated 2, 3, 4, 5 days in a row. Are you okay? Do you need anything? Is there anything that I can do? Do you want to talk? Do you want to this? And it really made me understand the things that I've been doing, and they're worth it. So I do make sacrifices. One of the sacrifices that I made was that I decided that I didn't want to play trumpet as much anymore. And not because I wanted to give up trumpet, but because I did not want to give up my family. And so that was one thing. When I conduct, I do not take everything that comes. I could easily work twice as much as I do. And there are people that I know that travel every weekend or every week from January through May. And they enjoy it, and that's fine. I always tell people I got married because I want to see my wife, because I want to have coffee with her on the weekends and during the week. I had kids because I want to go to their soccer games. I want to watch their dodgeball tournaments. I want to be there. And when my father passed away, I reevaluated all that. And I thought, am I really doing those things? Because in that moment, all those gigs, all those all-state bands, that didn't matter. All the pieces that I have out there that sell, that didn't matter. What did matter was having my family and my friends around me. And, you know, some of the greatest conductors, and I'm not going to name them, some are banned. There are some incredible orchestral composers, conductors, I should say, some incredible pop conductors. I mean, household names that when you ask them sacrifices they made, they'll talk about, you know, how many marriages they've gone through. They'll talk about addiction. They'll talk about depression. They'll talk about all of these things that suddenly you think to yourself, I thought they were living the greatest life in the world, and suddenly I feel sorry for them. And so for me, it was always important to make sure that was never an issue. And I tried very hard to make sure that if I'm gone 2 or 3 weekends in a row, that next weekend I don't do it. Now, you asked about sometimes there is a shift, and there is a shift sometimes. And there will be those occasional times where, wow, and also a trip to Australia came up that is just a great opportunity, so I'm going to take it, even though I had something else going on then, right? I had one summer where I was the composer in residence for Music for All. I was a composer and conductor for the Maryborough Music Conference Orchestra in Australia, and I was a composer in residence for the Texas Bandmasters Association. That was all in the end of June and July. So do you think I had much family balance in those months? No. But those were all really big things, and it just felt right to take those. But then you better believe in the months surrounding that, I was home. And so knowing that there will come those times where those imbalances happen, but that has to be the exception and not the norm for me. And I think that's what's going to make me able to do this for a very long time.
Right. My condolences on your father's passing.
I appreciate that.
Of course.
I do not have regrets. I do not regret a single moment, and that's why I feel as strong as I do right now. Because there's no, I wish I had seen him more, or I wish I had talked with him more. I don't have those regrets. And that's how I knew I was living my life the right way.
We've already talked about this a little bit. And there's a big question, and there's a lot of different answers to this. But what are the challenges facing music education, and how can we best meet them?
To be honest, the obvious challenges are being able to establish legitimacy of it in school, right? Why do we need music education? I think the best way we can possibly address it is from the things that you and I talked about: repertoire selection, and then what you do with that repertoire selection. I guarantee you, if you do a concert and in that concert, your administration is in the room and you do a lyrical piece and they're in tears and everybody's in tears, they're not going to question the validity of your program. If you do a piece where everybody is just at the end of it are just standing ovation going nuts because it was so incredible and exciting and engaging, they're not going to question the validity of your program. When you have kids volunteering to do different things, when you have fundraisers happening, when your band is doing things for the community, when your band is engaged on multiple levels, when they're working together, when there are kids that might have special needs that are able to participate in band and do things that they're not able to do in a quote unquote typical classroom setting, you will not have educators, administrators questioning the legitimacy of your program. And so I think we need to, rather than fight for the program, we need to let the program show why they don't need to be fought for, right? It's sort of like this quiet fighting in the background. And I think we bring the passion. We bring those elements and we make rather than fighting for the program, you make the administrators ask themselves, how could we not have this? Like, what would we do if we didn't have this?
Yeah.
And get a one at festival. That always helps too.
So, Brian, if I could give you a time machine and you could travel back to your high school graduation, what's the one bit of advice you'd give your 18-year-old self?
I think the one piece of advice that I would say is remember who you are. I think everybody that goes to college learns a lot. We all learn a lot. But then when you leave college, you spend an exorbitant amount of time trying to be somebody you are not, trying to be a teacher that maybe you had in college or that you observed when you were student teaching, or a composer whose music you played, or a performer who you wanted to sound like. And those are all great ideals, but ultimately, you've got to realize who you are. Nobody ever became great. Nobody ever made an incredible mark on the world because everybody says they are so amazing because they are just like that other person. People become amazing because they bring their own mark. They bring their own style, their own unique twist to something. And that's one thing I would tell myself is be true to who you are. And then the other thing, which I did eventually learn, is to make sure that you appreciate all of the people around you and that you surround yourself with the most amazing people possible, but that you always remember the amazing people around you.
Yeah. I always think, I know you're friends with Andrew Hitz. I always think about it, the way he says that is, decide where you're going to go and then fill the bus up, then decide where you're going to go. Put all the people around you that you need to have around you, then figure out where it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And Andrew has had so many different careers, and continues to, and he's a very good friend. But I think, one of the reasons when he left Boston Brass is because he realized I can't have the family that I want to have and do that. That was his moment. And I know he misses performing as much as he was, but he still performs a lot. He still does a ton of master classes, but I don't think he's ever been happier.
All right, Brian. So I'm going to ask this in two parts. The first part is going to be about just any work, any piece of music. And the way I ask it is, if you could plan it out, what would be the final work that you'd like to conduct or hear or engage with?
Mahler 2. Mahler 2, no question.
So how about a piece of your own? If someone were to say, Brian, I want to know who you are as a composer, what piece would you point them to?
There's maybe two. One piece is called Grace. It's a piece that I wrote right before, and then did another performance right after when Baltimore erupted in all of those riots. I had written a piece called Grace that I'd finished the week prior and premiered it the day before, about how you handle yourself, how you hold yourself, the way you give thanks to others, all the different connotations. And then I watched my city fall apart. And so that piece has a lot of emotional meaning to me. The other one, which your listeners are going to have to wait until May, is a piece called Breaking Point. And it's a piece that I finished 2 days before my father passed away. And it was about what it was like for months to go through a day have your world shattered into pieces and completely fall apart, pick yourself up the next day and go at it again, only for it to happen all over again and over. And I wrote this piece. It's probably, I wanted it playable because my father loved he loved the music that was me, but playable. So it's an easy 4. But at one point it ended so angry and loud on a unison note. And then the day before I flew home to see my dad, who had just informed me that he was no longer going to do any treatment, he called me and said, I'm at peace with everything now. It's okay. And at that point I realized, I was like, I ended the piece the wrong way. And so there's this big angry series of events followed by essentially my own original Bach chorale. And it ends as softly as you could possibly imagine. And that was my father. And it's funny, it's not funny at all, but as the chorale goes on, the spaces in between each phrase get longer and longer as my dad's breathing is slowing down. And so it's very emotional, but it's who I am.
And that'll be coming out in May.
It'll be, I've already recorded it, but the official premiere will be in Wisconsin, and that'll be in May. So we'll put it up online. It's called Breaking Point. So it will be out.
All right, Brian. So beyond that, I'm going to release this episode next week, so it'll come out around April 8th. Is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
Nothing really coming up that I'd like to share or promote. I mean, I'm going to be in a state near you, conducting an ensemble near you, so come say hi. For the trombone players out there, I invite you guys to check out a new album by Jeremy Wilson called Perspectives, and he commissioned me to write a piece for 18th trombone choir and soloist, and so that's a great insight into my professional level writing, and boy, do they just play amazing. And so, I just, nothing in particular other than, if I'm around, I'd love to meet you.
Perfect. And Brian, how can people get in touch with you?
I'm the only Brian Balmages in the world. Pretty easy. So brianbalmages.com, and there's a contact button there, and that'll go straight into my inbox.
Brian, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.